Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, What's New in ReExt 1.0. My name is Mark Guzmano. I am a sales engineer at Sencha. And in this webinar, we're going to talk about the new capabilities and updated capabilities that have been implemented in ReExt since its introduction. We'll also show some demonstrations of some of those capabilities. I know some of you may be new to ReExt, so I'm going to start out with a very brief introduction to what ReExt is and how you can get started with the product. So, and then a couple things before we actually get started. The webinar will be recorded, so if you want to refer back to it or send a link to a colleague so they can learn more about ReExt, that will be available shortly after the webinar. And if you have any questions that come up during the webinar, use the GoToWebinar questions tab or panel to type in that question. At the end of the session, we will go ahead and answer those questions in a Q&A session. One last thing, if you have follow-up questions after the webinar, or you would like more information or discussion of ReExt in your organization, please feel free to email me. You see my email on the slide, and I will also make sure I put that back as we are doing Q&A. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to do is look through the enhancements and talk a little bit about some of the bugs we found and fixed, and expanded framework support that we built into ReExt and what's available today. We've also spent time to make sure that ReExt integrates with major frameworks, major React frameworks. We'll talk about that a little bit more, and we'll demonstrate some of that. And most of what we're going to do is demonstrate some of those things. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So as I said, I don't want to make any assumptions that you've seen ReExt or know what it is. So let me start with that. ReExt is the Sencha product that is used to allow for integration of the Sencha Ext JS components within React, within the library React.js. So it's very simple. It's actually just one component, a component named ReExt, and you interact with that component by giving it values for props. As you can see in the lower left-hand corner, I'm demonstrating how you would use ReExt to implement the button component. Everything is driven by the X-type prop. So X-type button is a button, X-type grid is a grid, etc. You then have classes that you can specify or styles. But the meat of the component is the config prop. The config prop will hold all of the object properties that correspond to the X-type you're using. So for a button, there is a text config. For a grid, there's going to be a columns config, a store config, etc. And then you can have numerous events that you can respond to. So for a button, an on-click event makes sense. For a grid, an on-select event. So that's really what the ReExt component is all about. You can access the ReExt component in the public NPM repository. I have a browser window with that repository up, and the name of the repository package is @sencha/reext. So this is the page that you can use to review some of the things I'll talk about. It's got some documentation, some description of how you use the product. You also have the ability to install the component into your React application, and we'll go through some of that. But essentially, the ability to use React to integrate the Ext.js components and make them live and work and breathe in your React application. That is what ReExt is. Okay, we're also going to talk basically about what's new since the product was released. And I went back, did a little bit of history digging, and our initial version 1.0 product came out August 26th of 2024. The latest one, which is 1.0.425, was released a few weeks ago. So ReExt is about 6 months old. So in that 6 months, there's been a lot of activity. I've met a lot of people and worked with a lot of organizations that were looking at ReExt, looking at how to integrate that into React, looking at how to utilize some of their existing Ext JS applications. And this right here is just a laundry list of some of the version history. And this is just a repeat of what's on the public NPM repo page under this table of contents number 12 version history. So what we're doing is just keeping this very simple. That's one of the big philosophies of ReExt. Keep it very simple. As we create new versions that are available for consumption, I've just been able to use a one-liner to talk about what that particular version has in it. And as you can see, some of the more recent ones were just some inherent logging that we forgot to remove. But in reality, if you go back to the slides here, it's these items in red that are really more enhancements or advancements in the product. So we're gonna focus for the most part on these enhancements, and I'll have a slide that kind of boils that down for us. So just one more kind of overview to create a starter application. It's pretty straightforward. If we go back to the top here and go over to this quick start number 3 here, you can see here that we give you some terminal commands that make it very, very easy to get started with ReExt. So just to demonstrate that, I'm going to grab this particular set of terminal window commands. I use a Mac, and the most popular way to create a React application nowadays is with a tool called Vite, V-I-T-E. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and create that. I'm going to bring up a terminal window and basically just paste that in. So by pasting this in, it's going to run all of these commands at the same time. So I'll let that run, kind of giving an idea of how long it's going to take. It's a matter of seconds. So it's created the project, it's done an npm install, it has copied a few sample files, and certainly in less than a minute, we have a running React Ext application. Granted, it's very simple. Granted, it's not pretty, but it is a working application, and it is a great starter application. So what we have here is we have a little specialized logo that just tells you what the environment is that you're running in. And you can see here we're using ReExt 4.25, which is the latest version. We'll talk about the version of React and Next.js and the toolkit and theme as we move forward. I have a ReExt button here. That button just toggles rows and columns. I have a grid, and that grid, when I click on a row, will show me that grid's data in 3 display fields. So that's as easy as it is to get started. And once you get started, you can start experimenting with some of the things that ReExt can do, including the things I'm going to talk about today. All right, so as I said, there's been quite a bit of activity over the last 6 months, working with a lot of you customers to hear what you want in the product, to discover and fix issues that were in the product. So we've been trying to be very, very responsive. We want this to be a very, very modern, very, very up-to-date product. That is definitely one of our philosophies. So this boils down the last 6 months in terms of what's different from when we first released. And let's kind of go over them at a high level, and then we'll go into each of them to describe what they are. The first thing is we're continuing to innovate on the product. We are taking feedback and trying to apply it where we can. One of those things that we're working on right now is the concept of what I've called helper components. And they're experimental right now, but they seem to work pretty well. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. We've also created first-class support for ReExt children. So those of you who've used Ext JS know that we have container components like panels and containers, and those can have children. Within ReExt, you can create that hierarchy within React JSX, and I'll show you that. We've added and tightened up support for right-to-left language and locale support. So I'll show you a quick example of that in case you're using any right-to-left languages or you want to support different locales, different languages within the application. We really are excited about your potential ability as an Ext JS customer to use in total your custom Ext JS components in ReExt. That's probably the #1 thing I've heard. I'm an existing customer. I've spent a lot of time building a custom grid component that's based on the Ext JS grid. It's got a lot of features that we like for our application, and we don't want to have to rewrite that. We don't want to have to go to a different library and rewrite it. We don't even want to rewrite the code. We want to use it as is. So that's what I will talk about with using custom Ext JS components in ReExt. And then I'll also talk about support, keeping up to date with the latest versions of the popular libraries and frameworks that are bubbling to the top in the React ecosystem. So with that, let's start doing the fun stuff. Let's go into some demonstrations. And first thing I'll talk about is this experimental helper component. And a lot of these examples are available for you to see if you go over to the npm package README file. In the table of contents, the first item is this examples. So if I click on this examples, what this is kind of like a kitchen sink. We're pretty famous for having an Ext JS kitchen sink, and this is similar. This is all of the components we can use, all of the ways that we can use it, along with the source code for how you would use that. So on the left-hand side here is a list of examples. In this particular first example, it's a tab panel. On the right-hand side here, we have the code, the ReExt code or the React code that's used. This is a ReExt application, and pretty much all of the components in here are ReExt components. For example, this left side is a ReExt tree view. We have a grid view, pivot table. We'll go through some of those in particular. But the first item that I wanted to talk about was helper components. And what do I mean by helper components, and how are they compared and contrasted to regular components? So as I mentioned before, the product itself is based on the singular ReExt component. So for example, in this code here, this is a pretty complicated screen. It shows a couple of things. It shows different sub-children, children of children. There's grids in here, there's layouts, there's all sorts of things. But let's focus on what elements are in here. So you'll notice that when I want to use the ReExt component, I import ReExt. That is the main component. But you'll also notice here that I have some other imports, and these are the experimental imports that kind of make things a little bit more specific to each component. So let me compare and contrast that. So if I look over here, here's a good example of a ReExt button. So that right there, we're using ReExt. We're creating an X type of button, and we have a config that specifies all of the configs relative to that button. We can do the same thing with a grid. We can create a grid that is a ReExt grid that uses just the ReExt component. But this is a little bit generic for some people, and this is feedback that we've gotten. So everything being a ReExt component, questions came up. Is there any reason we can't have a ReExt button component and a ReExt grid component instead of just a generic ReExt component? So We said, yeah, that's possible. So as you can see here, we have more specific components, ReExt grid, ReExt panel, ReExt button. These are components that still use the underlying ReExt component, but are a little bit more specific to that particular component's config, and the configs show up as props within the component. So to boil that all down, let's take an example here where we have a ReExt button, and here we have a ReExt component with an X type of button. That's the base way to create a button in ReExt. But then we also have a ReExt button, and you can notice some slightly different syntax. Here we have to specify the button for ReExt, and we can specify any X type. But in ReExt button, it already knows that it's a button. And instead of having a config that has the objects that are corresponding to the button, we've elevated the objects that are relevant to that component up to props of the ReExt button. So you can see here, ReExt button has a text prop as opposed to a config prop that contains the object that contains the text prop. So a slightly different feature. This certainly requires a little bit more maintenance as props change, but we're never going to get rid of this base ReExt component. So really, this is a stylistic thing. How would you like to use ReExt? Would you like to use it in a more generic way, or would you like to use it in a more specific way? There's no performance difference. This is a very, very thin layer on top of ReExt. So just to give you some of our thinking, those are available in the current version. You can use them, but they are experimental. They aren't officially completely supported, but I will say if you use them, my experience has been they work pretty well, and we're pretty close to saying that they are, official and real. But those are the helper components that are available. The next one I want to talk about is ReExt children, and the concept of children is demonstrated here, but it's a little bit complicated because there are so many children here. So what I'm going to do is bring up another project, and that project is called ReExt Children. ReExt, sorry about that. Change directory to ReExt Children. There we go. All right, so this is a generated ReExt project. And if we look in package.json, we'll see that indeed it is a React project. We have React and React DOM here. And then here is the component for ReExt. And then what's different about this from the standard generated application that I just demonstrated is that I put some custom code in here to demonstrate children. So I'm going to go ahead and run this just so you see what it looks like. So pxvt-open. So this will compile and build that application and then present a browser window. So you can see here that this is now a little bit simpler. We have a panel and a ReExt panel. And then within it, I just created 3 buttons. First, a second, and a third. These are ReExt components. They're button components. And you'll notice that the first one, or the first one is half the size of the second 2. So I just wanted to demonstrate some of the capabilities with creating children components within a parent component. So let's put this over here to the side so we always can see that. And let's put my code window over here, and let's take a look at what created this, this page. So you can see here I'm on the app.jsx page, and I have a panel that starts at line 20. So a ReExt panel, it has some config. So I'm telling it that it has a title of parent and that the body style has a padding of 20. That's why I've got a little padding here. And then instead of closing off the component like I do for this logo component, I leave it open and I have some children components. So specifically from here to here are children components. So these are the 3 button components that are right here, 2 of which are using the ReExt component, the 3rd one which is using the ReExt button component. So you can see up here that I'm importing ReExt itself and then that experimental ReExt button component. And you'll notice that each of these is drawing as a child of the panel. For the 2nd button and the 3rd button, you're noticing a property or a prop called child flex. So under the covers, Ext JS uses the flex model of CSS. And this is just saying, flex the 2nd button with a number 2, flex the 3rd button with a number 2. And since I don't have any flex at all on the 1st button, by default, it's 1. That's why these are twice as big as this button. And again, it's very natural. You can also put regular components as children. I just demonstrated this with ReExt components as the children. But this is something that should be very useful if you're building complex parent-child type applications in ReExt. All right. The next example I want to show you is a right to left languages and locales. So let me go back and close this and come back here. And I'm going to get another example here, which is the ReExt RTL. All right, so this example, and I'll do the same thing I did before. I'll do an npx vite-open. That will open up the browser window. I'll stick that to the left side. I'll stick this one to the right side. So this is the base example that I created initially, but you'll notice that it's right to left. So the text here is in English. It says grid in Hebrew, but if I look at the menus, let me take this menu, you'll notice that the menu text in this particular case is in Hebrew. So Hebrew is one of the right to left languages. And not only do we see that as a language, but we see everything shifted from right to left. All the column headings by default, all the titles. So that support is inherent within the components and hence inherent within the ReExt component. So let's talk a little bit how that was done. And to do that, I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm going to talk about the starter point for a ReExt application. So once we've installed ReExt in a Vite application, the starting point is this main.jsx file. And you'll notice in main.jsx that we've added to the root render a ReExt provider. And ReExt provider is one of the components that comes with ReExt. And you can see here that I'm downloading it here. And the ReExt provider is globally available to all of the application. That's what a provider is in React. And it includes this ReExt data prop. So ReExt data is your way to tell ReExt what to use from an Ext JS components point of view. So you can see here I'm using 7.8, which is the latest version of Ext JS. I'm using the classic toolkit. I'm using the classic theme. I have an ability to use some of the more advanced Sencha packages like charting or calendar or D3 or pivot. So all of those currently in this particular example I'm not using, so they're set to false. But here's the parts that I needed to add so that I had right to left support and also providing for a locale. So RTL by default is false. You can set it to true. That will automatically get the right library to allow for right to left support. And then locale is just a 2-letter locale. HE happens to be Hebrew. Just to complete the picture here, there's a few other things under here, whether you're debugging, The location is kind of important. Location says where are we pulling the underlying Ext.js components from? And in this case, by default, it's remote. And remote means it's coming from our remote CDN. And you may have noticed that the components for Ext.js say Ext.js trial on it. That's because our remote access is pulling a trial version. There is documentation to tell you how to get a production version, how to install the production version. If you have questions about that, or if you want me to go into some details on that, please just let me know, put a question in, or I can take that offline to give you more details on that. So anyway, these two fields enable right to left and enable locale. And then one additional thing you need to do, if you're in any ReExt component, you need to add an additional config to say, for this particular component, I want RTL turned on. So that this component right here is this one right here. And that's why I get right to left. And that's why I get that particular locale or language. So it's pretty easy to add locale support. And again, that was some great feedback from a customer that allowed us to make sure that was smoothly implemented. All right, now let's talk about what I consider to be probably one of the most significant things about ReExt. And it's the ability to use custom Ext.js components within ReExt so you don't have to rewrite your custom components that you built in Ext.js. So obviously this is for customers who have been building Ext.js applications, now want to move to React and don't want to write or rewrite everything, all the good stuff, all the tested components that you've built within Ext.js. So that's the premise. And so let me kind of describe that and show you what that means and how that works. And it's a couple steps here, so bear with me. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up an Ext.js application. So I generated an Ext.js application with Sencha command, and that's this application right here. And those of you who've done Ext.js probably will recognize this. This is just a standard Ext.js application. This particular application goes to a main view. That main view is over here. And then this main view shows a tab panel with some tabs. So let me run this so you can see it. So to run that with Sencha command, you say Sencha app watch. And Sencha app watch will start. It will compile or build the application for development. And then at some point when it's ready, the application is available on port 1841. So as we're doing this, let me go to port 1841 and let's take a look at the application. Okay, so as I said, the main page is just a tab page. It happens to be tabs that are on the side here. And what I did is I added this new tab. I added this new tab called Messages. So if we take a look at what Messages is, if we scroll down a little bit here, Messages is showing an X type called Messages Grid. What is Messages Grid? Well, Messages Grid is something in this Messages folder. It's a custom component. So if I open up the grid itself, this particular custom component happens to be extending from the Ext.js grid panel. And here's the X type. I called it Messages Grid. And just to keep the example somewhat simple, all this is doing is reading from a store. And that store is right here, second file. And that storage is reading a data file. That data file is down here, and it's just a bunch of JSON data. And then this grid has two columns, and those two columns use the very powerful template capabilities of the grid. So we've got two columns here, 1, 2, and the grid works just fine in Ext.js. So the question is, can I use that custom component? Can I use the Messages Grid within my ReExt application? So let's go ahead and close this, come back here, and let's go to ReExt custom Ext JS. So I'm going to go ahead and open this project and just explain what this project is. So this project was initial. Well, let me first run it. So npx vite open --open. All right. So here is that here's this project. So you'll notice this looks similar to the first project that I generated. You know, here's the table that gets generated, but I've added this new grid here. What is this? This looks like exactly the same grid that was in Ext JS, and that indeed is what it is, but now we're in React. With ReExt, we're creating a messages grid, but we're using React or ReExt to do that. And this is the same ReExt functionality, or this is the same custom grid functionality that we saw in Ext JS. So the question is, how did I do that? How did I bring in those custom components, and how does that work within ReExt? So let me close everything here and kind of give you an example here. So first off, I brought in to my public folder the two Ext.js components, the grid and the store. Those are exactly the same two components that were in the Ext.js application. So no differences. I'm just going to use them as it is. The next thing I do is I tell the ReExt provider what custom Ext.js components I want it to load for me. And that's these two fields right here. So I'm back in main.jsx in this case. I'm using the ReExt provider. It's bringing in this ReExt data object. And in the ReExt data object, I've added two more properties. The first property is the folder under the public folder where these things live. And then the second property is an array of all of the files that I want the ReExt provider to load in the order that I want them to load, because I want the store to be available before the grid, because the grid uses the store. Those of you who've done Ext JS might say this is very similar to what the requires keyword does in Ext JS, and you'd be correct. It's very similar in concept. It's making sure everything's loaded and available so that I can use that component. And if you recall, the X type of that component is messages grid. That's just what's in the Ext JS component. So if I go to my app.jsx, you'll notice that this right here is using ReExt against that custom X type. So I'm bringing in 100% of that custom component, and I'm able to do things like use the events that are part of that grid right within React. What you don't notice on purpose is you don't see a columns or a data prop, because the custom component already handles that. So if I go back to the custom component in Ext JS, there's a columns property or columns config, and there's a store config. There's actually also a title config. So those three things are already part of the custom component. So when I create the ReExt component, I don't have to specify those. Those are already done. And all I'm doing here to enhance this a little bit is saying I will handle the select event. And just the select event will do some things with the data for the selected row. So I go back to the example just to remind you of what it did. You'll notice here it is. Here's the component, just like it was in Ext JS. And as I'm clicking on these items, you'll notice these fields are being filled in. I'm getting undefined for name and phone because this particular grid doesn't have a name and phone, but it does have an email. So in that particular case, at least I'm getting email. But I just wanted to give you a simple example. This, to me, is a very powerful way to not have to rewrite your application, to bring you into the world of ReExt, and to take advantage of all of that custom component code that you may have built up, and the end result is that you're able to move forward, not from start, but from the aspect of utilizing those custom components within your React Ext application. All right, so that is custom components. And this particular screenshot, by example, or as an example, is just one of the pages of that examples application that I brought up. It's the one called Ext Mail. Where I got this, there's a white paper and a tutorial that we've built that shows you how to build a mail system, an email system with Ext JS. So I thought that would be a great example. So I took the heart of the grid that's used in that Ext Mail application. And I said, well, I want to bring that into ReExt. And that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing that custom component built within the ReExt demo application. All right. The next thing that we've done is make sure that the ReExt product stays up to date and is using the latest libraries and the latest frameworks. And that's something we are going to continue to focus on. So for example, since ReExt was released, the React team released React 19. And within days or hours, we were up and running with the React 19 application. So you'll notice that if you look at this little logo box, all of our examples, all of our demos, everything that we're doing now, the component itself, the ReExt component, uses React 19. And it can use the latest version of React 19. I think there are sub-versions now, but that is something we wanted to make sure was happening, the moment the React ecosystem delivered the new version. You'll also notice that the Ext JS version by default here is 7.8, which is at the moment the latest GA version of the Ext JS components. There is work being done right now for 7.9. We are working to make sure that the moment that's released, that the ReExt environment will support the 7.9 environment. We support both toolkits of the Ext JS components. There's a classic toolkit and a modern toolkit, and we support all of the themes. So the themes like classic or Triton or Neptune or Material, all the themes that are provided are also available within ReExt. I just happen to pick the classic toolkit and the classic theme in this particular example. There are also React frameworks out there. So a little bit of background. React considers itself a library. So if you get React, if you download React, what you have is an infrastructure for creating components on the client in the browser. You don't get any components. You just get an infrastructure to create components. So React is really a library to do browser-based component development. React has gone so far as to recommend what are called React frameworks. So if we take a look at this particular page, this is from the documentation in React. It says, if you're going to create a React app, they strongly recommend using a full stack framework. So what is a full stack framework? It's a framework that understands how to build things for the browser and the client, and also for the server. And this is not a tutorial on full stack frameworks, but if you have questions, let me know. Two of the most popular full stack frameworks are Next.js and React Router. So we support Next.js. The latest version of Next.js is 15. So we support Next.js 15. We also support React Router 7. You'll notice in the slide, you'll notice up here in this slide that I specify Remix/React Router 7. Remix was the product that was kind of a competitor to Next.js, but Remix has merged into React Router. And now if you go to the Remix documentation, you'll see that they're recommending using React Router. And React Router 7 is the latest version. So the bottom line is that we support the latest libraries. We support the latest Ext JS environment for the components. We support the latest version of React, React 19, and then we support the latest version of these two major full stack React frameworks, Next.js 15 and React Router 7. And I do have demos of those. If someone is interested in seeing some of that or wants to get examples, or you're starting to work in one of those environments, I'd be happy to spend some time with you to kind of give you the example of how you use these ReExt components. And it's very similar. I mean, under the covers, Next.js uses React for clients, and so does React Router. So it's basically the same idea, but there's some nuances between those libraries, and we wanted to make sure that we supported those. Okay, so that's really what our first 6 months of ReExt have been all about. We've been very busy. I've met a lot of you. We've got a lot of excitement about this product. We love getting feedback. A lot of the feedback that I've gotten over the last 6 months are the things you're seeing here, and we continue to be open to that feedback. I would say if you are interested, if you're currently a customer, you own ReExt. This is part of the Ext JS license, so you own it already. If you want to spend some time to discuss it and how it works within your organization, probably the best thing to do is talk to your sales contact at Sencha, and we can get a discussion going. I can be a part of that. I can really kind of help you understand how it works within your organization. But we just wanted to highlight and give you guys an example of what's happened since 1.0.0, and we're hoping that the next 6 months are as exciting and full of good ideas and feedback as the first 6 months have been. So with that, I'm going to see if we have any questions. Remember, if you have questions and you want to ask me directly, please email me. That's my Sencha email account. I'd be happy to talk further. If, as I said, if you want to get kind of a more detailed or comprehensive look at things, contact your salesperson and they'll coordinate with me so that we can get that done. But let's go ahead and see if there are any questions, and we'll answer them in the remaining time we have.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark, for completing your 6 months for ReExt. That's a great news. My name is Raj. I'm a marketing manager at Sencha. Now let's move on Q&A session. If you have any questions, please type them into your chat. We will address as many we can. Okay, let's dive in. With XJS 7.8 release approaching, does ReExt support it?
Yeah, the question might be when 7.9 comes out, because 7.8 is the current version. Certainly, we totally support 7.8. Yes, we intend to support every version of Ext JS as it comes out. I didn't say this, but we support all 7x versions. So if you're on 7.4, we support you. If you're on 7.6, we support you. We want you to be as far along as you need to be. So as 7.9 appears, we will definitely support that. I don't know that we have a timetable for that quite yet, but I know it's coming. So as soon as it comes, we intend to have it tested and supported. So thank you.
Great. Yeah. Sorry, that's the 7.9. The user was asking.
Right.
The next question here. Yeah. So we are considering using ReExt, and currently we are using XJS components. Like, what would be the best way to get started?
Yeah, no, that really is one of the main focuses, and that was the demo that I just showed you with the grid messages. I think the complication becomes how did you write your Ext JS application? Is it written with components? Are those components isolated so that it's pretty straightforward to bring them into ReExt? how do I know what all the dependencies are? There's a lot of things to think about. But we do have simple examples that you can look at. But if you have a use case that you feel it would be helpful to talk further, let's have a discussion about that, because we can look at a high level at your application. We could understand how or what the opportunities are. What I've seen being very successful is to do a very simple proof of concept. Take something meaningful in your application, but don't take the most complex thing. Usually it involves a grid. Bring that into ReExt and let's get a very simple application up and running. From there, you'll learn a lot, and you can kind of create a strategy for doing the rest of things. There's a lot of customers who are trying to figure out, how do I both support my existing application and start into this new world with ReExt. And so one of the things we found is, as I was working with the customers, they said, well, one of the things we want to do is we want to iframe some of our existing Ext JS applications, and then we had another customer who wanted to iframe the ReExt part of the application. So there were some little anomalies with that, and if you look through the list of versions, one of the versions addresses ReExt being in an iframe. So that was a good use case that was brought up, and we have full support for that now, and I appreciate that feedback as we were going through this. So again, it's totally doable. It's built into the application, but it can be complicated with your use case. Please get a hold of us and we can talk further.
It's great. Thank you for a detailed answer. The next question: we are using custom Ext.js component called grid store. How can we use it in React?
Custom Ext.js component called what? What was the other part of that?
The grid store.
The grid store. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point that I really didn't call out. ReExt itself handles visual components within React. So grids and tree views and buttons. You can't, well, I've never even tried it, but ReExt is not intended to be used with X types of store. That really is a non-visual component and really is a support component for one of the visual components. So if the question is, how do I use ReExt to load a store, that really isn't the right question, because as I showed you, you can load anything from Ext JS, including non-visual stores, using the custom folder, custom files approach. And then you can use that store anywhere you want. You can use that in a ReExt component. You can use that in the experimental ReExt grid component. You can embed that component store in your custom Ext JS component, which is probably what it's doing now, and just expose the visual custom component. So there's a lot of options to that. One of our intentions was to, in some form or fashion, be able to support the entirety of your application. And if you're an Ext JS developer, stores is a big part of the application. So my advice just initially is load those stores with custom files, custom folders, and then use them within ReExt components. But again, if there's something more specific, please let me know. We can have a discussion.
Or a wrapper around Ext.js. I know it says someone is new, I guess, for React.
What was the question?
The question is that ReExt is a native React component or a wrapper for around Ext.js?
No, good question. So as you saw, there is a requirement for Ext JS. There is the Ext JS library does get loaded. So the question is, did we rewrite all of the Ext JS components to make them React components? And the answer is no, we did not. The reason we didn't do that is there's a couple of reasons. One, the Ext JS component library is very performant, very fast. The grid is extremely fast, and all the components work together. So the ReExt is actually an interface or a layer or whatever you want to call it to the Ext JS components. But it's not a simple layer. You use the ReExt components like you would use React components. So one of the things you can do, for example, is you can put a variable. Let me give you an example here. If I go over here to the demos application, that's right here, and I go over to this big data grid. I think this one's a good example. So when I click on each of these grid rows, I'm filling in these fields down here, which are ReExt display fields. So if we look at the code for that, you'll notice that the ReExt display fields have a dynamic variable for the value. So if we go back up to the grid and its click event, or its on select event, and this one's not as good. Let me go to just a regular old grid that has, yeah, this one maybe. You'll notice that in this particular example, it's doing the same thing, but these display fields are being clicked on. Each of these rows is being clicked on, and the way those rows are being selected is in this on select event of the grid. And if I go up to the on select event is not directly updating the display fields. All it's doing is it's setting a state variable. So you'll notice here that I have a state variable called row, and it has a set row set. So when I get a select, I set the row. This row field changes, and the way React works is if there's anything using that row variable on the page, it'll redraw that field, and that's what these display fields are doing. Notice the value is in brackets here. That means it's code. This is React code that says, hey, if the row has changed, change this value. So as I'm clicking on these things, these values are changing in a React way. So that's what I mean by it's not simply just a layer on top of the ReExt components. It's actually a React component, and it makes the Ext JS components React components. So we didn't want to rewrite them. We wanted to maintain the fact that they're very performant. We knew we had a lot of use cases where users were Ext JS developers, and they want that functionality to be the same. So we accomplished all of that with the way we're doing things now. So hopefully that helps. If there's still some confusion, please re-ask the question or ask me offline.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. The next question, can the custom Ext.js components be defined with all its events and just be called ReExt like a React reusable component? It seems to be a follow-up question to that. Again, can you pass in props?
Can you read that one more time?
Here, can the custom Ext.js components be defined with all events?
Oh, sure.
All its events. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So the question I think has to do with custom components, but more specifically has to do with events.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, the question is just can we call them ReExt like a React reusable component?
yes. So let me see if I answer the question by talking about the select event. So every Ext.js component, hence every ReExt component, has a set of events, and they're different per X type. So a grid happens to have a select event. So if you went to the Ext JS documentation, you would see that one of the events is select, small s, S-E-L-E-C-T, no capital S. The way you use every single component within ReExt is you put the word on in front of it and then capitalize the first letter. So on select is an event for the ReExt grid. On click with a capital C is the event for the click event for a button. So the way you know which events exist is you use the Ext JS documentation. You find those events, and all of those, every single event is supported. There's nothing additional we have to do. So I don't know if that answers your question. If you built a custom component that has its own events, you can use those events just like you would use any other event. I don't have an example of a custom event, but any and all events of the Ext JS underlying components are available to ReExt. Hopefully I answered that. If I didn't, re-ask the question. May have not understood completely.
Okay, appreciate that. And the follow-up again, can you, I mean, the question, like, the follow-up here is, can you pass in custom props?
Can you pass in custom props? Well, again, let me just do that. Let me answer that question in the context of, I'm not going to talk about ReExt Grid or all these experimental components. Let me just talk about it in terms of ReExt. And let me see, where do I have one? Yeah, there we go. No, that one doesn't have one. Let's do bar chart. Okay, this one is that the fact that ReExt supports the charting that's in Ext.js means that there is a ReExt component that has an X type of Cartesian. The config is the workhorse. Any of the components that the underlying Cartesian or chart component supports is what you put in here. And you could put custom things in here as long as the component understands it. If you're asking the question, can I have another prop in ReExt? Well, ReExt supports what it supports. It supports X type and config. But you certainly could build your own component that supports whatever props you want. And those props could be fed to your ReExt components in any way you want. I mean, this is just pure React. So if, for example, you'll notice this page here, which is a pretty complicated page. It's got ultimately ReExt things on it, but look at how it's structured. Here's the file itself. First off, notice that this slider thing here, that's not part of the Ext.js components. It's just a open source split component that is between other components. You'll also notice that this split component on the left-hand side here is not splitting any ReExt things. It's splitting a component called big data. And big data is a component that was written, and big data, which is right here, that is the component that has ReExt on it. So I could have had big data have whatever custom props I wanted because I wrote that component, right? And then when I go into big data grid, I could have props coming in. The way you do that in React is you, in these parentheses here, you put the word props, and then you have props dot whatever custom component you wrote or custom prop you wrote. And I could use that anywhere in this component I wanted, including, the title of this component. This could have been a variable, and it could have come in from the parent component that called this component. Again, all the way you work when you work with React. That's the whole point here. This is React.
Thank you. We have one last question for the day. Will be the version for mobile?
Okay, yeah. So as far as mobile goes, the reason we have two toolkits, we have a classic toolkit and a modern toolkit. The modern toolkit of Ext JS used to be Sencha Touch, which is a product we built specifically for building mobile applications. So Sencha Touch became the modern toolkit. Within that modern toolkit, there are components that are very oriented towards mobile. So instead of a real complex grid on a mobile app, you want a list. You want a scrollable list. You want to be able to drag down on the list and have it refresh. All the things we're used to in a mobile application. So if you want to build a mobile application and you want mobile components and you want the mobile components from ReExt, the answer is yes, you can do that. And the traditional way you would do that is you're building basically a small browser application, and there are tools and techniques to wrap that into an application. That used to be tools like Cordova and PhoneGap. Now Cordova still exists. So absolutely you can do that. If you want a completely ReExt modern toolkit application, you could just leave it as a small browser-based application. A lot of our customers do that. They just say, hey, I want it to work and look well on a mobile device, and having it serve from a browser is just fine. Or you could put a wrapper on it so that it's actually an app that you could go get in the App Store, and then it would run as the application within inside that container. Again, it's a little more complicated than that. I believe we were doing or did a webinar that talked about Cordova recently, so do a search on that. Cordova within Ext JS. You'll find how that is accomplished.
Awesome. We got 1 minute. Maybe we can take one last question
Sure,
here. Just is modern toolkit has RTL?
Modern toolkit has, what was the last part?
I mean, I know it's maybe it's Kobe. If you could, I mean, we got like a short form which is called RTL.
RTL, does the modern toolkit support right to left languages? Is that what the question is?
That's right. Yeah.
I don't recall. I've used right to left in the classic toolkit. I'd have to take a look, but certainly if it does support it, it's supported in ReExt. And again, I would have to go look to verify that, but anything that's supported in the underlying toolkits is supported in ReExt.
Awesome.
Yep.
Appreciate. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's wrapped up our presentation for today.
Great. We appreciate it, everybody. If you do have questions, as I said, please give me a shout or give your sales rep a shout, and we look forward to talking to you. Thank you.
Awesome. So one last thing before you guys go, we also have an exciting ReExt contest going on with cash prizes to be won. Check it out, ReExt contest page for more details.
Yeah, just real quick, go to Sentia.com, go to the ReExt contest, win big prizes. So check that out. Yeah, we're trying to see what creative things you can build with ReExt. Good point.
Thank you for joining us and for your time.
Thank you.